Imagine waking up in the dead of night, only to see your own reflection staring back at you. But something is wrong. It's smiling, no, grinning, when you are not. This is the real experience of a real person, and by the end of this story, you will never look at a mirror the same way again. Some places carry a weight, not the kind you feel on your skin, but something deeper. Something that settles in the air, pressing against your thoughts, making you feel like you're never really alone. This town, it had that weight. Emma drove in just before sunset. The roads were empty, the houses quiet, their windows dark like watching eyes. It was small, forgotten, the kind of place where everyone knew each other's names, but still spoke in hushed voices when certain things were mentioned. And this town had stories, ones that never made it past the county line, stories about the mirror. But Emma didn't believe in stories. She didn't believe in anything she couldn't see or explain. She was here for one reason, to clean out the house and move on, an old place left to her by an uncle she had never met, a house she never wanted. It sat at the very edge of town, where the streetlights ended, where the trees stretched their limbs just a little too far. The driveway was cracked, weeds creeping through like they were reclaiming what had been abandoned. She stepped out of the car, keys cold in her hand, and stared up at it. The house was still, the kind of stillness that doesn't come from being empty, but from waiting. Paint peeling, windows clouded with dust, a roof that sagged as if the house itself was tired. The front door groaned when she pushed it open, the sound too loud in the quiet. The air inside was thick, carrying the scent of old wood and something else, something faint, something wrong. She told herself it was just an old house, just walls and floors and forgotten things. But as she stepped inside, the silence changed. It wasn't the kind that came from emptiness, it was deeper, heavier, the kind of silence that listens. Shadows stretched long across the floor, shifting in the dim light as she moved through the rooms. Her footsteps echoed, but they shouldn't have. The furniture was covered, shapes of a life frozen in time. The air felt colder in some spots, warmer in others, like the house itself was breathing. She shook off the feeling. Nerves, exhaustion, nothing more. She walked through the rooms, flipping on lights that flickered before holding steady. Dust floated in the air, catching the glow, dancing in slow, lazy spirals. There was no reason to feel like someone was standing just behind her. But she felt it anyway. A trick of the mind. That's all it was. That's what she told herself as she set her bags down. As she exhaled, as she tried to ignore the way the hair on her arms stood up for no reason at all. She was alone. Of course she was alone. And yet, somewhere deep inside the house, something shifted. The attic smelled of dust and time. The air was thick, heavy, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. Emma moved carefully, stepping over old boxes, pushing aside forgotten things covered in thick sheets. She didn't know what she was looking for, until she found it. The mirror. It stood against the wall, hidden beneath a cloth that looked untouched. Taller than her, framed in dark wood, carved with twisting shapes that almost looked like faces if you stared too long. She pulled the sheet away, and dust swirled in the air. The glass was smooth but not perfect. Small cracks stretched along the edges, barely noticeable but there. She sighed. Just another old thing left behind. Probably valuable, but to her it was just furniture. She was about to turn away when she saw it, tucked into the frame, a small folded note. The paper was yellowed, brittle at the edges, like it had been there for a long time. She pulled it free, smoothing it out with her fingers. The words were written in shaky ink, uneven, rushed. 5 simple words. Never let the reflection linger too long. She stared at it, waiting for some kind of meaning to hit her, some kind of understanding, but nothing came. Just an old note, probably a joke or something left behind by the last person who lived here. She let out a small laugh, shaking her head. Superstitious nonsense. She folded the paper, stuffing it into her pocket without another thought. The mirror was heavy, heavier than it should have been. As she pulled it forward, the weight fought her like it didn't want to be moved. She braced herself, gripping the sides, dragging it inch by inch toward the attic door. It was awkward, hard to carry, and by the time she made it down the stairs, her arms were aching. She set it down in the bedroom, breathing hard, wiping dust from her hands. The house felt different now, like the air had shifted, but she ignored it. The mirror looked fine against the wall. A perfect spot, right across from the bed. A place where she could see herself first thing in the morning. That's all it was. She stepped back, studying her reflection. The glass was darker than she expected. Deeper, like looking into a pool of water just before it swallows the light. Her own face stared back at her, eyes tired, mouth set in a firm line. But there was something else. A feeling. Like the mirror was staring back. She blinked and the thought was gone. Just her mind playing tricks. She turned away, shaking it off. She was overthinking again, letting the house get to her. It was just an old mirror, just another object in a house filled with them. She didn't see it. The way her reflection lingered, just a second too long after she turned away. The house was quiet, too quiet. The kind of quiet that wasn't just stillness, but something deeper, something unnatural. The air felt heavy, thick with a silence that pressed against the walls. Emma lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to ignore the way the darkness felt different. She told herself it was just the newness of the house, the way old places settle, the way emptiness plays tricks on tired minds. But then she heard it, a whisper. Soft, almost nothing, but it was there, a breath of sound in the silence. She turned her head, listening. The wind, the house settling. She swallowed, closing her eyes, but then it came again. Her name, faint, drawn out. But the worst part wasn't the whisper itself. It was the voice. It sounded like her. Her eyes snapped open. She sat up, scanning the room. Nothing, just shadows stretching long in the corners. Just the soft glow of the moon through the window. Just the mirror, standing across from the bed. She told herself she was imagining it. Just a trick of the mind, a half-dream slipping into waking. But she couldn't shake the feeling, the pull, the weight of the silence pressing down, urging her to look. Slowly, she swung her legs over the side of the bed. The floor was cold under her feet, the air colder. She took a breath, forcing herself to move, each step slow, careful, like she was walking towards something she shouldn't. She stopped in front of the mirror. Her own face stared back at her, same tired eyes, same unsteady breath, but something felt off. She blinked. Her reflection blinked slower. A second too late, just enough to notice, just enough to send a sharp, ice-cold feeling through her chest. Her breath caught, her hands clenched at her sides. No, that wasn't right. She blinked again, harder this time, forcing herself to watch. But now it was fine, perfectly normal. Her heart pounded against her ribs. She let out a shaky breath, rubbing her arms, trying to chase away the chill creeping up her spine. Just exhaustion, that's all it was. She leaned in closer, pressing her fingertips to the glass, just to prove to herself there was nothing there. And then, the mouth in the mirror twisted, wide, too wide. Lips stretching back, splitting into something that wasn't a smile, wasn't human. Teeth too white, too sharp, a grin that didn't belong to her. Her breath hitched, and then it was gone. Just her own reflection, staring back at her, still, silent, mouth closed like it had never moved at all. A cold rush of panic shot through her. She stumbled back, her pulse hammering, breath coming too fast. Her mind screamed that it wasn't real, that it was just exhaustion, just a trick of the light. But her body knew better. Something had smiled at her. She forced herself to turn away, to move back toward the bed, to pull the blanket over her like a shield. She squeezed her eyes shut, willing sleep to come, willing her mind to let go of what she had seen. She told herself it was nothing, but something was watching. Time started slipping. Emma would wake up in bed, then blink, and suddenly she was standing in front of the mirror, hands limp at her sides, eyes locked on her own reflection, breath slow, too slow. She didn't know how she got there, didn't remember moving, didn't know how long she had been standing there staring at herself. The first time, she told herself she was dreaming. The second time, she wasn't so sure. By the third, she knew something was wrong. She tried to fight it, tried to keep track of herself, forcing herself to stay aware, but the blackouts got worse. She would be brushing her teeth, then nothing. Then she'd be there, in front of the mirror, staring, eyes dry, lips parted, body frozen like a puppet waiting for its strings to be pulled. She started waking up with her feet aching, knees locked, stiff, like she had been standing too long. She tried to move the mirror to drag it out of the bedroom, but the weight of it was unbearable, too heavy, too much, like it had rooted itself to the wall, refusing to be moved. And then the scratches appeared. At first they were small, barely noticeable, tiny lines near the corners of the glass, but they weren't on the surface. They were inside, buried deep, clawing their way through the reflection itself. Each morning there were more, dragging downward, digging in, stretching like something inside was trying to get out. She covered the mirror, grabbed a sheet from the closet and threw it over the glass, hands shaking, breath coming too fast. She didn't want to see it anymore, didn't want to feel that pull, that thing calling her closer, stealing time, pressing its weight against her thoughts. For the first time in days, she let herself breathe. It was done, covered, out of sight, out of mind. It was just an object, just an old mirror, nothing more. Then the whispers started. Soft at first, faint, just a breath against the silence. Then louder, hissing through the room, curling into her ears, slipping beneath the sheet like fingers dragging against glass. Her name, over and over and over again. She pressed her hands over her ears, squeezing her eyes shut, whispering to herself that it wasn't real, that it was all in her head, that she just needed rest, needed sleep, needed to stop looking at that thing. And in the quiet between her thoughts, something chuckled. From behind the glass, Emma needed answers, needed something, anything to explain what was happening. So she started looking, digging through records, searching the town's history, trying to find where the mirror had come from. What she found made her stomach turn. Eliza Crawford, a name buried deep in the town's past. A woman who lived more than a century ago, when this place was still growing, when superstition ran through the streets like water. She had been wealthy, known for her beauty, for her charm. But people whispered about her, said she was strange, said she had secrets. The records were faded, hard to read, but the story was always the same. She had dabbled in things she shouldn't have, rituals, darker practices, things that made the church keep its doors locked at night. And then one day, she vanished. No body, no trace, just gone. But her mirror remained. The house was abandoned after that, left to decay. The few who dared enter spoke of seeing her reflection in the glass, a face that shouldn't have been there, and those who took the mirror, none of them kept it for long. Some went missing, some were found, lifeless, eyes open, mouths frozen mid-scream. No signs of struggle, no explanation, just gone, like the mirror had swallowed them whole. And then there was the warning, passed down in whispers, scribbled in old journals, tucked away in records no one was meant to find. When the reflection smiles, it's already too late. Emma exhaled, her hands cold against the keyboard. It was ridiculous. A story. a ghost tale twisted by time. She sat back, running a hand through her hair, telling herself it was all just folklore, that none of it mattered, that the mirror was just a mirror. She closed the laptop, pushed away from the desk, tried to shake the feeling curling in her stomach. She turned toward the covered mirror, the sheet still draped over it like a body beneath a shroud. And then she froze. The sheet moved. Not a lot, just a twitch, a slow, careful pull inward, like something inside the mirror had taken a breath. Her pulse slammed against her ribs. She took a step back, fingers gripping the edge of the desk. No, it had to be the air, the draft in the house, something, anything, but what her mind was screaming. The whispers started again, low, slithering through the room like a thing with teeth. Then the sheet slipped. Just an inch, just enough. Enough for her to see her reflection. She hadn't moved, but it had. It was staring at her. And it was smiling. The sound pulled her from sleep. Sharp, sudden, like ice breaking underfoot. Glass. Her breath caught in her throat as she sat up, pulse hammering in the silence. The room was dark, but something felt wrong. The air was colder, thick with something heavy, something watching. Her eyes flicked to the corner of the room. The mirror. The sheet was gone. Her stomach dropped. No, she had covered it. She knew she had. She had tucked the edges tight, made sure there was no way it could slip. But now, the glass was bare, open, waiting. She swallowed hard, her throat dry as she swung her legs over the bed, forcing herself to move, forcing herself to look. The reflection was there, her own face staring back, but something was off. She moved, slowly, turning her head to the side, raising her hand. The reflection followed. Then she dropped her arm, and it didn't. Her chest tightened, breath coming too fast, too shallow. She took a step back, muscles locking, every part of her screaming to look away, to run, to leave the house and never come back. The reflection smiled. Not the kind of smile that belonged on her face, not hers at all. It stretched too far, lips curling back, too many teeth showing, skin pulling like it was barely holding together. Her hands trembled. Her legs wouldn't move. She wanted to blink, wanted to break whatever hold this thing had on her, but she was afraid. Afraid of what would happen if she did. Then her reflection twitched. The arms bent first, slow, deliberate, wrists turning the wrong way, bones shifting, bending, folding like wet paper. Emma sucked in a breath, a strangled, broken sound. Her own hands ached, fingers twitching as if whatever was in the glass was pulling at her, testing the limits of what was real, what was hers. The thing in the mirror kept smiling. The head tilted next, not like a person moving, but like something trying to figure out how. The neck stretched, the skin tightening, the bones inside pushing against it, straining, creaking under invisible hands. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. She couldn't move. Then she blinked, and it was there, pressed against the glass, face inches from hers, eyes wide, mouth open, grinning. A sound tore from her throat as she stumbled back, crashing into the bed, heart pounding so hard it hurt. She clutched her chest, gasping, shaking, waiting for it to come through, waiting for it to pull her in, waiting for something to happen. But it didn't move. It just stared. Like it was waiting too. Emma needed proof, needed to see it with her own eyes, needed something, anything to make sense of what was happening. So she set up the camera. She placed it across the room, facing the mirror, its red light blinking like a heartbeat in the dark. Then she climbed into bed, pulling the blanket up to her chin, staring at the ceiling, telling herself it was just for peace of mind. Just to prove she was overthinking, just to prove she wasn't losing herself. Sleep came slowly, dragging her down, pulling her under. Then, nothing. The next morning she sat in front of the screen, breath tight in her chest, finger hovering over the play button. Her pulse thudded in her ears. She pressed it. The footage started. At first it was still, just the room, silent and undisturbed. Then, movement. Emma watched herself sit up, watched herself slide out of bed, bare feet touching the floor. Slow, careful, like she wasn't really awake. She moved toward the mirror, steps dragging, arms limp at her sides. Then she stopped, just stood there, staring. Seconds passed, then minutes. No movement, no change. Just her body, frozen in place, locked onto her own reflection. Then she turned, walked away, moved back to the bed and climbed under the covers like nothing had happened. Emma exhaled. The breath she hadn't realized she was holding left her in a sharp, shaky rush. That was it. Sleepwalking, that's all it was. She almost laughed, almost felt relief. Almost. Then she noticed something. Something small. Something wrong. In the footage, her reflection was still watching. She felt it like ice in her chest. Her real body had turned, had left the frame, but the reflection had stayed. Eyes locked forward, unmoving, unblinking. Her hands clenched into fists. Her breath came too fast. She wanted to stop watching, wanted to turn off the screen, wanted to delete the footage and never think about it again. But she didn't, because just as she was about to look away, the reflection moved. Not the way it should have, not following her, not copying her. It turned its head, slowly, too slowly. Bones pressing against skin, twisting, stretching, until its face wasn't looking into the mirror anymore. It was looking at the camera. Emma's stomach flipped. Her whole body locked up, frozen in place, unable to breathe, unable to think, unable to do anything but stare, as the thing in the screen tilted its head, the corner of its mouth curling upward, eyes too dark, too deep. Then it spoke. Not loud, not clear, just a whisper, crawling through the speakers like it was dragging itself out from somewhere it shouldn't be. "I see you." The screen went black. Emma shoved the laptop away, chair scraping against the floor as she stumbled to her feet, her heartbeat crashing in her ears. She could still hear it, could still feel it. She turned to the mirror, to the sheet still covering it, still hiding whatever was inside. And in the silence, something knocked from the other side. Emma wasn't alone anymore. She could feel it, under her skin, inside her thoughts. Something shifting, something pulling. It started small, things she could brush off. A strange look from a cashier, a friend asking if she was all right. Moments of confusion that passed as quickly as they came. But then it got worse. She saw herself. Not in the way she should have, not in mirrors, not where reflections belonged. She was walking past a shop window when she caught it, the glimpse of a figure standing just inside the glass. She turned her head, expecting to see her own movement follow. But it didn't. It was still and staring. She stopped, stepped closer. Her breath fogged against the glass. Her reflection should have done the same, but it didn't. It only smiled, a slow, stretched grin, the same one from the mirror, the same one that didn't belong to her. She stumbled back, blinked, and then it was gone. She tried to shake it off, to forget, but it happened again and again. A puddle in the street catching her face at the wrong angle. A glass door where her reflection lingered a second too long after she turned away. Every time it was waiting, and she wasn't the only one who noticed. Her friends started looking at her differently, talking to her carefully, like she was something fragile, something broken. They asked strange questions, questions she didn't understand. "Where were you yesterday? Well, what do you mean? You were just standing there for hours, not moving, just staring." She shook her head. No, she wasn't. She had been home, she had been sleeping. But the way they looked at her, the hesitation, the fear, she could tell they were telling the truth, and that meant she wasn't. Then came the voices, not whispers, not distant, but her own. One of them laughed, shifting uncomfortably. "You were acting weird earlier." "Weird how?" "I don't know, you were just talking different. Your voice sounded off, like it wasn't really you." Her stomach turned. She tried to play it off, to laugh, to change the subject. But the feeling stayed, curling tight in her ribs, pressing against the base of her skull like something else was settling there, something shifting inside her skin. She barely slept, she barely ate, and when she did, the food tasted wrong, like it wasn't meant for her. The worst part wasn't knowing something was happening. The worst part was realizing it had already started. Emma wasn't staying another night. She had made up her mind. The mirror had to go. She didn't care what it was, didn't care where it came from, didn't care about the stories, the history, the warnings. It was leaving. Now. She grabbed the heaviest thing she could find, a hammer from the kitchen drawer, fingers gripping it so tightly her knuckles turned white. She stood in front of the mirror, breathing hard, heart slamming against her ribs. The air around it felt thick, like stepping too close to something that was alive. Her reflection stared back, blank, still. She lifted the hammer, swung. The glass didn't break. Not a crack, not a scratch. The force should have shattered it, should have sent it crashing into 1,000 pieces, but the mirror stood there, untouched, unmoving, waiting. She hit it again, and again, harder, desperate. Nothing. The hammer slipped from her fingers, clattering to the floor. Her breath came too fast, too shallow, her pulse pounding like a scream trapped inside her body. She wasn't strong enough to fight this. Not alone. She made the call. The man arrived hours later, older, tired, someone who had seen too much, lost too much. He stepped inside, took one look at her, then at the mirror, and let out a slow breath. How long? Her voice was barely there. Too long. He nodded, walked toward the mirror, moving like he already knew what he would find. He didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. He had seen this before. He stood in front of it, staring, eyes scanning the glass, following the cracks that had deepened, the dark spaces inside that didn't quite look like a reflection anymore. His face hardened, his jaw clenched. Then, barely above a whisper, he said it. "If the reflection is smiling, you are no longer in control." Emma swallowed hard, hands gripping the fabric of her sleeves, knuckles tight. She didn't want to look, didn't want to see if it was true. Then he went still. His shoulders locked, his breath caught. His fingers twitched once, then again. Then his hands rose to his throat. Emma's stomach turned. "Hey, are you all right?" He didn't answer. His nails pressed into his skin, digging, dragging. His mouth opened, a strangled sound breaking from his lips. His body jerked, twisting as if something inside was snapping, something under his skin was tearing him apart. His eyes rolled back, veins pressing against the surface, lips turning blue. Emma screamed. She lunged forward, grabbing his arms, trying to pull his hands away, trying to stop whatever was happening. Then she saw it. In the mirror, his reflection wasn't moving. It wasn't clawing. It wasn't gasping. It wasn't dying. It was staring, and it was smiling. She let go, stumbled back. His body hit the floor, the sound too loud, too real. But his reflection, it was still standing, still looking at her, still waiting. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't move. Then his reflection took a step forward. Emma couldn't stay here, not anymore. The house was wrong, the air was wrong, and the mirror was still standing, untouched, watching. She ran to the garage, hands shaking, feet unsteady. She searched blindly, knocking over boxes, shoving aside useless things until her fingers found it. A can of lighter fluid, a box of matches. Her breath hitched as she clutched them to her chest, heart slamming against her ribs. This had to work, it had to. She burst back into the bedroom, her steps slowing as soon as she saw it. The mirror was waiting. The body on the floor was still there, cold, silent, but his reflection had moved. Emma didn't stop to think, didn't stop to breathe. She ripped the cap off the lighter fluid, hands trembling as she splashed it across the glass, down the frame, over the floor beneath it. The scent was sharp, thick, suffocating. She struck the match. The flame flickered, small and fragile in the dark. She swallowed hard, lips pressed tight, then threw it forward. The fire caught fast, a sudden rush of heat and orange light. The flames curled around the mirror, climbing the wood, licking at the glass. She stumbled back, breath coming fast, waiting, begging for it to break, for it to crack, for it to shatter into 1,000 useless pieces. But it didn't. The fire twisted, bent, fought against something unseen, and the glass, it moved. Not like something breaking, like something breathing. The surface rippled, slow at first, then faster, like water disturbed by an unseen hand. The reflection inside was no longer hers. It was watching her, eyes dark, lips curled into that awful, impossible grin. Then it reached out. The hand shot through the surface, like liquid turning solid, fingers ice cold as they wrapped around her wrist. Emma screamed, yanked back, pulled with everything she had. But the grip was strong, too strong. It was pulling her forward, the glass widening, stretching like a mouth opening too wide. She dug her nails into the floor, feet scrambling for something, anything to hold on to. But the force was relentless, dragging her closer, closer, until the cold swallowed her fingers, then her arm, then her shoulder. The last thing she saw was her own face, grinning, mouth curling back too far, eyes hollow, empty, hungry. Then the darkness swallowed her whole. Silence. Then a breath, slow, steady, controlled. The screen stays dark for a moment longer. Then light, soft, normal. The world outside the house. Emma is at work. She sits at her desk, fingers moving across the keyboard, eyes fixed on the screen in front of her. Papers are stacked beside her, a coffee cup half empty at the corner of the desk. Phones ring in the distance. Conversations hum around her. Everything is normal. She laughs at something her co-worker says, nods along, answers a question with that same easy tone she always had. Everything is fine. But then she looks at the camera, not by accident, not a glance, a deliberate movement, a slow turn of the head, and then she smiles. Not the way she used to, not the small, tired smile of someone getting through the day. This one is wrong, too even, too wide, like her face is remembering how to do it rather than feeling it. The screen flickers, just for a second, just enough. And in that second, there is something else, a reflection. In the window behind her, just barely visible, a figure standing in the glass, mouth open, hands pressed to the surface, eyes wide with terror. The real Emma, trapped. The smile on the other Emma's face doesn't fade. It stays, stretching just a little too far, just enough to see that she isn't Emma at all.